What has happened to the Minnesota Vikings defense? They're doing a Houdini act. Mr. Disappearance out there. First 5 weeks of the season, lights out. Shut down the Giants. Shut down the 49ers. Shut down the Texans. Played super well against the Packers. They made a second half run, but they played well for the most part. The offense and special teams unit was more to blame in that game. And then they also shut down the New York Jets. Out of nowhere, after the bye week nonetheless, the Vikings are without Blake Cashman and Turf Toe. And I guess he was the anchor, the everything to this defense, because since he's been out, other teams have just torched the Minnesota Vikings. Jared Goff goes off on the Minnesota Vikings last week. 4 touchdown drives, all of them over 69 yards. This week, Matthew Stafford enters the game with 3 total touchdowns. Without Puka Nacua, without Cooper Kupp for most of the season. Got to have that caveat in there too. And into this game, he goes 25 for 34, 279 yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 pick. And here's the problem with those stats. The Minnesota Vikings defense did not make Matthew Stafford uncomfortable. You know, he had one play where he avoided a sack from Jonathan Greenard and Harrison Phillips and threw a touchdown to, was it Cooper Kupp? So, tremendous play by Matthew Stafford. Minnesota Vikings defense missed out on a play. But what made this game so frustrating from the defensive standpoint is that Matthew Stafford had all day to throw. This Minnesota Vikings defensive philosophy of, oh, you don't know who's coming. Is it possible to know this defense? It's so amazing. Nobody knows how to solve it. It's a mystery that nobody can solve. Well, Ben Johnson solved it last week. Sean McVay solved it this week. They are 2 of the brightest minds in the NFL. But that's back-to-back weeks where the Minnesota Vikings defense has looked pathetic. And here's the statistic that tells the story. So going into this game, the Los Angeles Rams had 3 offensive linemen not playing. And that's why I thought the Vikings would win. And I also thought Puka Nacua was also not going to play. But then he came out of nowhere, and the Rams were like, oh, we're cautiously optimistic. And they played, and they torched the Vikings as well. But this statistic tells the story. The Minnesota Vikings pressured Matthew Stafford on only 3 of his 34 dropbacks. That 9% pressure rate was their lowest in a game since 2020, per ESPN research. This tweet was sent out by Kevin Seifert. What happened to the vaunted, intimidating, nobody can score on us Minnesota Vikings defense? I guess they need Blake Cashman back, and they need him back in a hurry, because this thing has flipped upside down so quickly. And here's the big issue that I've noticed. Earlier on in the season, and they showed it last night, the Vikings had 1 pick of Matthew Stafford, and I think they lead the NFL in interceptions with like 12. But earlier on in the season, what was happening was that the Minnesota Vikings defense was getting, quote unquote, I'll call it the perfect turnover. The other team would have the ball on their own 20, 30-yard line, 40-yard line even. And the Minnesota Vikings would force a turnover. They did it to Stroud. They did it to Purdy. They picked 6 to Aaron Rodgers. They did it against the Lions to get the lead late in the game. And that set up the Minnesota Vikings offense for so much success because they're already in scoring range. And how many times have we seen it this season? There's been multiple where the Vikings defense forced a turnover in the opponent's territory, and then 1 or 2 plays later, the Minnesota Vikings scored a touchdown. It's happened a lot. And now we're seeing the blend of, okay, the Minnesota Vikings defense is not forcing a turnover. in the opponent's own territory. And the Minnesota Vikings offense is not as smooth as it was the first 5 weeks of the season. That's what's happening here. That's the common thread. The Vikings scored 29 points against the Lions. How many of those points were because of the Lions' mistakes and the Vikings defense made a play? Well, 14 of them. You had the fake punt. Aaron Jones ran it into the end zone a few plays later from like 30 yards out. Then Ivan Pace Jr. picks up the fumble forced by Josh Metellus' peanut punch, runs it into the end zone. So 14 of the points against the Detroit Lions weren't even really manufactured by the Vikings offense. It was a gift from the Vikings defense. And that's what we've really seen for most of the season. You know, this game where Matthew Stafford had one turnover, and I wouldn't even consider it a bad turnover. You know, there's good turnovers and bad turnovers. The Rams weren't in the red zone about to score. They weren't in their own territory, which allowed the Minnesota Vikings to score right away. They were at like the 50-yard line, and Matthew Stafford threw a pass. Byron Murphy picked it off. Terrible throw. Picked it off. Minnesota Vikings had to actually put a drive together to score, and I think they scored a field goal on that play or something like that. But you know what I mean? There's a difference between turnovers. If you're on your own territory, that's a bad turnover. If you're in the red zone about to score, that's a bad turnover. But if you're at the 50 and you have a 20-yard pass and it gets picked off on third down or something like that, it's just a punt. It's not a big deal. It's the same as a punt. Not all turnovers are the same. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the Minnesota Vikings defense getting exposed by two bright offensive minds, Sean McVay and Ben Johnson. And Sean McVay was without three offensive linemen in this game. So the fact that the Vikings only got 3 pressures on Matthew Stafford in 34 attempts is ridiculous. The Minnesota Vikings need this break. My goodness, they need to get Blake Cashman back. Do anything you can to get this guy back on the field, because since he's been out, the Vikings defense has looked atrocious, giving up 30 points to the Rams and 31 points to the Lions. It's not looking good. And it's not just 30 points to the Rams and 31 points to the Lions. It's the way that they've done it. Meaning, when the Vikings needed to get a stop against the Lions, late in the game, Lions marched right down the field, had no problem getting a field goal. When the Los Angeles Rams had the ball offensively and the Minnesota Vikings were down by 21-20, get a stop, get the ball back, kick a field goal, win the game. Couldn't get a stop. Couldn't stop them. When the Vikings defense needed to get a stop these past 2 weeks, they didn't do it. They couldn't do it. And we are seeing the Minnesota Vikings find the median, the middle. Everything was going way too perfectly for the Vikings this season. And that's what I've been saying for weeks. Oh, you're a negative Minnesota sports fan. Just enjoy it. I'm just telling you what's about to happen. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it a lot. 5-0 is awesome. I like to watch the Vikings. But there was something that wasn't right. Meaning, things were going too right. Things were just clicking. Everything was too easy. And now we're seeing them fall back to earth. They're finding the average. And that's what we're seeing. So I'm not surprised by this one bit. In fact, I told you it was going to happen. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making this podcast part of your day.